journalist Evan Weiner.
Well, thank you, Stephen. Thank you to the East Hampton Library for inviting me. My name is Evan Weiner. Been doing this thing for a very long time, since 1971. And one of the guys I interviewed during my journalism career is that guy right there. And it was Richard Nixon on June the 23rd, 1972, who literally changed potentially, literally changed the lives of hundreds of millions of women since 1972 in the 48.5 years since he signed Title IX into law. Title IX, very simply, guarantees women equal educational opportunities at colleges and universities that accept federal funding. And there is a major line of division. It's 1972, and I straddle that line because I got out of high school in 1973. So I know people prior to 1972, women who graduated high school, and women afterwards. And it's like night and day. Guidance counselors back prior to 1972 steered women into nursing, teaching, secretarial work. After 1972, women found out they could become lawyers and doctors, and it was like turning on the switch. Let's talk prior to 1972 and what life was like for an intelligent woman who wanted to become a doctor or somebody who just wanted to become a teacher. First of all, Title IX, Patsy Mink, Congresswoman from Hawaii. It's the Patsy Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act. The Education Amendments of 1972, or Title IX, it's all part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which had 6 titles, and it was amended as it went on over the years. It was the third of 4 civil rights acts that were around from 1964, the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voter Rights Act, this one, and the Equal Rights Amendment. 3 of them got passed. 1 of them didn't, the Equal Rights Amendment, which is still out there in the ozones. In 1971, 2 congresswomen, Patsy Mink, Hawaii, and Edith Green, Oregon. They were given the chance to help other women pursue their dreams without gender discrimination, and they took to it. And the reason why I use the word dreams, because in the early 1970s, politicians who were in favor of Title IX said women need to pursue their dreams. But before we get into that, the pre-1960s thinking, the women are the happy housewives. They were Donna Reed on TV and others. So the pre-1960s thinking, and I was in San Francisco in November of 2019 before COVID hit, and there's a little museum. It's a pinball arcade museum. It's at Fisherman's Wharf, and every time I'm out in San Francisco, I go there because I have fun playing the old arcade games. And anyway, so there was one thing I was looking at, this old Nickelodeon. And I said, this would be perfect for my Title IX talk, because this Nickelodeon was from, roughly 1915, 1916, beautifully restored. And it had that poster in there. To be happy, see what every married woman must not avoid. So even the Nickelodeons are telling women, hey, you want to stay happily married? You better, hey, it's like the Jack Jones song in the 1960s, was that Lollipops or whatever it was called, where, put on your makeup when he comes home, look good, because he may have a secretary at the office that he may be eyeing, and look at you. Look at what you look like. June 23rd, 1972, Title IX of the Education Amendments is enacted by Congress, signed into law by Richard Nixon. The sponsors of Title IX are Birch Bayh in the Senate, Edith Green in the House of Representatives. Title IX prohibits sex discrimination in any educational program or activity receiving any type of federal financial aid. Now, before I go on, there are some thank yous here, because I didn't put this thing together by myself. And the thank yous go to Donna De Verona, who won 2 gold medals in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, swimming, to Nancy Hogshead Maker, who is now a professor at Rutgers University. She won a gold medal. in the 1984 Olympics in swimming in Los Angeles. Billie Jean King, who I've interviewed over the years, and she's part of this thing as well. Two guys, Harvey Schiller, who was the head of the Southeast Conference in college, and the late Shelley Saltman, who Billie Jean King's magazine back in 1977, 78, 79, edited by Peter Carey, who was my adjunct in college. He left Sports Illustrated for her magazine, the Women's Sports Foundation magazine. And they gave Shelley an honorary, well, not an honorary title, they gave him an award as one of the 5 most crucial men in developing women's sports in the 1970s. So those 5 people helped me out on this one. Now, I was about a little over a year ago, I was giving a talk at the West Orange Public Library. And it was a Super Bowl talk, and I got there early. The library opened at 12 o'clock. My talk was at 12:15. I got there about 11:45 just to get a parking space and you know, just relax and say hello to some of the people at the library, since I've spoken there quite a number of times. And I was struck by this picture. And one of my last live talks was in Riverdale, New York. And I was telling a story about this picture, and this woman said, I didn't know I didn't have a name. I was Mrs. Murray. And you pointed that out to me. I'm 82 years old, and I realized I didn't have a name. The library board of trustees, when the library opened in 1959, Mrs. Simon J. Griffinger. She didn't have a name. She was Mrs. Samuel A. Cristiano. He was a guy. He had a name. Roger W. Doring. He was a guy. He had a name. Herbert J. Dwyer. He was a guy. He had a name. Oh, Mrs. Alex J. Katz. She was Mrs. Katz. James J. Sheeran, mayor. He had a name. Dr. Rexford S. Soder, superintendent of schools. He had a name. William E. Lehman. He was the architect. He had a name. Women were referred to on old wedding invitations, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, so-and-so in family, but they had no names. And that was evident with the library board of trustees. This plaque has been up there now for 62 years, and Mrs. Simon Griffinger and Mrs. Alex J. Katz didn't have any names. And hey, you want to be a stewardess? Check this out. Welcome aboard Delta Airlines, 1965. If you want to be a stewardess, stewardess applications must be between the ages of 20 and 26. Never married, couldn't be married. Really in good health. Must adhere to strict figure controls, which in my mind is probably 36, 24, 36. That would be strict figure controls. Straight teeth. You had to have straight teeth. And you also had to have straight legs. And you had to have clear, smooth skin. And you had to realize that this wasn't going to be a career for you, that you were going to get there somewhere between 20 and 26, and you were gone by the time you were 32, because you had to be willing to retire between the ages of 30 and 32 to take on the greater complexities of marriage. That's how they recruited women in 1965. A lot of sexism, sure. Alan Ludden on Password. He's got Carol Burnett on. He's got Mitch Miller on. And Alan Ludden would bring on, he would bring on a woman, and he would say, Mrs. So-and-so, what does your husband do for a living? And if the woman was single, he would say, are you a working gal? Patsy Mink, Congresswoman, Hawaii. She's sitting there with men discussing whatever they were discussing that day. She faced discrimination. She faced a lot of discrimination as she was growing up and applying to schools. She was the first elected female president of the student body at Maui High School, the island of Maui, and then the territory of Hawaii. And she was the valedictorian of her graduating class at Maui High School in 1944. She went to the University of Hawaii, did rather well there, went to law school in the mainland rather, and went back. She was politically ambitious. In 1958, she was elected to the territory of Hawaii Senate. That was dissolved when Hawaii became a state in 1960. And she decided she was going to toss her hat in the ring and run for Congress, but she lost to Daniel Inouye in the Democratic primary. In 1962, she ran for election for the Hawaiian Senate. 2 years later, she was victorious in her race for a congressional seat in Congress. She was an early supporter of an effort to allow female members of Congress to use the all-male House gym. She gets to the House of Representatives, and guess what? Now she can't use the gym. Gym's for men only. Men only. She couldn't use it. She was an athlete. She played high school basketball back in Maui, and she wanted to use the gym, and she had to fight. She's a full member of Congress. She has to fight to use one of the perks of Congress, the gym. She was a champion of women's rights. She said she wasn't a feminist. In the late 1960s, she became an outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War, and she worked tirelessly on behalf of legislation in the fields of civil rights for the women and children, healthcare, as well as welfare and education. Now, here's where the discrimination kicks in. After her college years at the University of Hawaii, she had grades good enough to go to medical school. But she received 12 rejections due to what she believed was gender discrimination. I have a friend who lives in Hawaii, Fran Cummings. Fran's in her 80s now. And Fran was the valedictorian of her school in Salt Lake City, or the Salt Lake City area, back in the 1950s. And she came from a family of geologists. And she applied to school. She applied to a lot of geology schools. And Fran remains a very pretty woman in her 80s. And back in the 50s, she applied to a school. And a guy told her, well, we can't take you. And she said, well, why can't you take me? She said, well, listen, he said, listen, Fran, you got all the grades. We can't quibble with that. You have all the grades. You have better grades than anybody coming to who applied to the school. But there's a problem here. And she says, well, what's the problem? Fran, you're just too pretty. You're just way too pretty. And we go on geological digs and show people how to do things, that teach them how to do things in digs. All the guys are going to look at you. They're not going to concentrate on their studies and what they're supposed to be doing in the dig. They're all going to be looking at you in the same class. So, you know, Fran, you're great, but we have to reject you because you're too pretty. Well, she ended up becoming an educator and ended up running science departments at various schools. Her husband, Wes Cummings, was also a college professor, and either he followed her or she followed him to various schools. Getting back to Patsy Mink, though, and I have other stories like that too. She decided to opt for law school after the medical school said no, and she continued to face sexism because she was denied a job at a law firm when she got back to Hawaii because she was a married woman. Well, it was more than just she was a married woman. She was a married woman to a mainlander, a guy from Chicago. And that caused a big problem because she was no longer a resident of Hawaii. She was a resident of the mainland through marriage. She tried to start her own law practice, but before she started her law practice, she had to take a bar exam. And the government officials in Hawaii, territory of Hawaii at that point, said, well, you know, Patsy, you're not a resident here anymore. Yeah, how could that be? I grew up in Maui. I went to Maui High School, went to University of Hawaii. I was born and raised here. Well, your husband, he comes from Chicago. So because you're married, you're a non-resident. So she sued. And she won her fight to take the bar exam. And she won and passed the exam and became the first Japanese-American woman lawyer in Hawaiian history. She was a congresswoman from 1965 to 77, and then 1990 to 2002. And that is Patsy Mink on the left and Edith Green on the right. Edith Green is totally forgotten, but she was a congresswoman from Oregon. She was elected in 1954, so she served starting in 1955. And she focused on women's issues in the 1950s and 1960s. The issues included education and social reform. In 1955, Green proposed the Equal Pay Act to ensure that men and women were paid equally for equal work. In 1961, the fascist dictator of Spain, Francisco Franco, signed a bill making sure that men and women were equally paid for equal work. Think of that. Franco did that in Spain in 1961, and this bill is meandering and meandering and meandering. It's finally signed into, a form of it is signed into law by John F. Kennedy in 1963, but it really was very watered down, and women really didn't get equal pay. And to this day, they still don't. And there is Edith Green, Democrat from Congress from Oregon. She was known by a number of names, the mother of higher education. And what she did, well, for libraries, she was important. The Library Services Act, which provided access to libraries for rural communities. She got money so rural communities could build libraries. The Higher Education Facilities Act of 1963, the Higher Education Act of 1965 and 67. And she earned nicknames like Mother of Higher Education and Mrs. Education. I went to school in the late 1960s. I graduated high school in 1973, and I seem to remember that there were a lot of activities after school for boys, including sports teams, but not so much for girls. Very few programs after school for girls, a couple here and there. And but I went to school in the New York area. If you went out to the hinterland, so to speak, you might find that there weren't many programs for girls after school, and she sought to correct this inequality. And she helped to introduce a higher education bill that contained provisions that regarded gender equality in education, including after-school programs. Take a look at that picture. Does that picture look like somebody is about ready to be assaulted? Because if you say yes, that is the answer. This is the 1967 Boston Marathon, and that is Catherine Switzer. And the guy pushing her and about ready to throw her down into the pavement face first is Jock Semple, one of the organizers of the Boston Marathon. And the guy to Catherine Switzer's left, who looks real muscular and is real muscular, is her boyfriend, running the race basically to prevent scenes or a scene like this. Catherine Switzer was at Syracuse University back in 1966. She grew up as the daughter of a major of a United States Army major. So failure really wasn't an option for her. And she's matriculating at Syracuse University, and she's on one of the A team up there, and she tells one of the coaches that she was dealing with, yeah, I think I want to run the Boston Marathon. And the coach says, you're fragile, you're dainty, you're the weaker sex. You can't run a full Boston Marathon. That's 26.2 miles. Women are not equipped to do that. So she trained in secret and entered the race, but she entered the race as K. Switzer, not Catherine Switzer. And they didn't ask for your sex at that point. So she entered the race, K. Switzer, and got an entry into the Boston Marathon. And here's a closer look when Jock Semple is about ready to push Catherine Switzer into the cement. Notice they're running on cement, and she's going to go face first into the cement, which means, oh, she could break a jaw, break a tooth, get scratched up. But Jock didn't care, because here's a woman imposing on the Boston Marathon. The people who work for the marathon tried to physically pull her out of the race. When the race official, Jock Semple, tried to remove her from the race, her boyfriend, who was 235 pounds and a nationally ranked hammer thrower, running alongside of her, pushed Semple to the ground, and he hit the ground. Switzer would finish the race 4 hours and 20 minutes, proving that women were not the weaker sex, frail, dainty things. Remember frail, dainty things, because that comes up in a little few minutes again. Title IX, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And there is a problem when Title IX actually does get enacted because they put the word sports in there. And sports would become a major Title IX problem. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, and particularly 1971, when this thing does come out of committee with Mink and Green getting it to the House floor, Title IX was a highly controversial subject. Some supported the proposed law, but others thought it would be far too dangerous, just far too dangerous. You couldn't force schools to accept women because that would ruin American education. You can't do that. Our education system's fine. You're going to throw women in there? No, this can't be. This can't be at all. Donna DeVerona said that Title IX had a huge ally. The ally was Ted Stevens, the senator from Alaska. Oddly enough, when you look at Title IX and two of the people who really pushed Title IX, they came from Alaska, the 49th state, which became part of the Union in 1959. Ted Stevens, and Patsy Mink. Hawaii 5-0 became the state, a state in 1960. So Alaska and Hawaii make big contributions, not very far into their lives as states. Ted Stevens, Donna DeVerona said he was all aces when it came to this. In 1952, Ted Stevens' law career took him to Fairbanks, Alaska. He was appointed the U.S. attorney the following year, the new Eisenhower administration. In 1956, he returned to Washington to work for the Eisenhower Interior Department, and he would play an important role in bringing statehood for Alaska. He was elected to the Alaska House of Representatives in 1964 and became the House Majority Leader during his second term. He ran for Senate for the Republican nomination in 1968. Didn't win it, but a vacancy occurred when Nixon pulled one of the senators to put into the cabinet, and he was appointed senator. As a senator, he played key roles in legislation that shaped Alaska's economic and social development, including the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, and Title IX. And Title IX wasn't his only sports foray. He also sponsored the Amateur Sports Act of 1978, which created the United States Olympic Committee, now called the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. The Alaska Statehood Act was signed by Eisenhower July 7th, 1958. Alaska would become state number 49, January 3rd, 1959. And there's my buddy Donna. In fact, I just talked to Donna, and I'm doing that talk on women in sports in a couple of weeks here. And we were just going back and forth a little bit. I said, do you know that Edith Cummings, do you know who she is? She said, no. I said, well, she was a great amateur golfer and a debutante out of Chicago. Back in about 100 years ago. And I said she was the first woman on the cover of Time magazine. And she also was converted into a character in The Great Gatsby, Jordan Baker, because she was friendly with F. Scott Fitzgerald. And she said, wow, she said, that's interesting. I never knew that. She's the one who's telling me all about Title IX, and I'm telling her about the early days. But Donna won 2 gold medals in the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. Wanted to go to Stanford University, wanted to go to Stanford on a sports scholarship. Men were getting sports scholarship. The answer is no. She doesn't get a sports scholarship because women didn't get sports scholarships in those days. That wouldn't come until the mid-1970s when Ann Myers, the basketball player, got a scholarship to go to college. Donna DeVerona had the marks and had the 2 gold medals. And yet she can't get a sports scholarship to Stanford. Donna told me, without Senator Stevens as co-sponsor, I doubt Title IX would have survived. It was a time when we needed a strong Republican. He championed the rights of athletes and protected Title IX, as well as always being there when there was a challenge to the law. And there were many challenges to the law. Why Title IX for Ted Stevens? Well, he was an avid tennis player. He was able to see the value in sports and recreation reflected in both his personal and professional lives. He had girls, and his girls could not play Little League Baseball in either Alaska or the Washington, D.C. area. He wanted to change that. Title IX provided women's equity in sports. State of New Jersey allowed girls to play Little League Baseball for the first time following the passage of Title IX. That happened in 1973 for the 74 season. And there's my buddy Harvey Schiller. Harvey had shoulder replacement last year, and his Facebook icon or avatar or picture after he had the shoulder replacement was an X-ray with the screw in his shoulder. It's my friend Harvey. And there's Ted Stevens in the middle, and there is Donna DeVerona on the right. Now, before I get to Birch Bayh, I'm going to tell you about my 9th grade teacher at Spring Valley Junior High School in Rockland County, a guy by the name of Stewie Gates. Now, I was a year ahead in school. I was 1 year ahead, but yet 1 year behind in age with everybody else. So here we are, we're in 9th grade, and it's either 1969, 1970. I don't remember what part of the year it was, but it was part of the 69-70 year. And Stewie Gates, who retired about 7 years ago at the age of 88 from the Stony Point Fire Department, he was still climbing ladders at 88. And I said, Stewie, you know what, time to sit down, relax, have a good time. Don't worry about it, just answer the phones. Anyway, so here I am, I'm 13 years old, everybody else is 14. And Stewie decides he's going to give us an uncle talk, or friendly uncle talk. And he says, well, you know, you're going to be finishing 9th grade in June, and you're going to go up to Spring Valley High School, and it's going to be a different building next year. In 10th grade, you take the PSATs. In 11th grade, you take the real SATs. In 12th grade, well, in 12th grade, you get to choose what college you want to go to and what your major is. Oh, by the way, for all the girls that are sitting here, you know, you have an opportunity to major in 3 letters. MRS. Stewie Gates, MRS. Now, that's in 1969, 1970. Birch Bayh is trying to push this Title IX law or Title IX legislation into law in 1972, in the spring of 1972. And he sounds an awful lot like Stewie Gates when he gives his remarks from the Senate floor. He's an Indiana Democrat, Birch Bayh. He authored and introduced Title IX of the Higher Education Amendments of 1972, which for the first time prohibited discrimination on basis of sex in the classroom, on the athletic field. That was a mistake putting that in, according to Donna DeVerona, and I'll tell you about that in a couple of minutes. Protecting both students and faculty. There's Birch Bayh, a later picture of Birch Bayh. He's on the Senate floor, and he's giving a speech. And I read this, and the first thing I thought was Stewie Gates. In his remarks on the Senate floor, Birch Bayh stated, "We're all familiar with the stereotype that women are pretty things, go to college to find a husband, and who go on to graduate school because they want a more interesting husband, and finally marry, have children, never work again." Now, I've given this talk a number of times over the years. I've been giving this talk a long time, about 15, 20 years. And I was up in Stamford, Connecticut. Talk about that finally married thing and have children. I was up in Stamford, Connecticut, about 12, 14 years ago. And I'm in a seniors residence, and I'm talking about Birch Bayh, and the guy interrupts me right here. And he says, I have a story for you. I said, sure, because when I give talks, I'm not scripted. It's a back and forth and all. And so he says, I went to medical school in 1960. And he says, there were 96 people in the class, 92 men and 4 women. And he said, we're all sitting around, we're in the auditorium, we're sitting around, and the dean of the school is there, and he comes up and he's going to give a talk. And he gets to the podium and he says, he looks around and he says, can I have all the women stand up? They do, all four of them. And he says, what are you doing here? Why are you here? Are you here, this is 1960, to find a husband? Are you wasting a space that we could give to a deserving man, that we have you here? Do you plan to go through college? Do you really want to become a doctor? Why are you here? Are you here to have a husband? The guy thought it was humiliating for the four women who did go through medical school. Birch Bayh. The desire of many schools not to waste a man's place on a woman stems from such stereotyped notions. But the facts absolutely contradict these myths about the weaker sex. I always thought about the weaker sex. If they're so much weaker than men, how come they outlive men? They do. They do. Ever see the Alan King joke? Survive by, survive by, survive by. These myths about the weaker sex, and it's time to change our operating assumptions. While the impact of this amendment would be far-reaching, it's not a panacea. It is, however, an important first step in the effort to provide for the women of America something that is rightfully theirs, an equal chance to attend the schools of their choice, to develop the schools they want and apply those schools with the knowledge they will have a fair chance to secure the jobs of their choice with equal pay for equal work. Notice he talks about a law. He doesn't talk about how it's a woman's right to get an education. The women in the United States have to be protected by law to get equal opportunities in college universities for a degree, and also women professors, so they can get tenure. It's a law. It is not a right. Title IX was enacted as a follow-up passage to the Civil Rights Act of '64. The '64 Act was passed to end discrimination in various fields based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in areas of employment and public accommodation. However, there was a huge loophole, a really huge loophole in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because it did not prohibit sexual discrimination against persons applied at educational institutions. And so here we got the Civil Rights Act, but it does no good for women trying to get to college, because they could be denied and they don't have to be told why they were denied if they ask. Hey, we just denied you. That's the end of that. Women students were denied equal opportunity under the law and academics. Women applicants were routinely denied equal access to medical school, law school, engineering school. I had a person from the university who went to the University of Pittsburgh, Dobbs Ferry Library, about 3 years ago, telling me she was the only woman at the engineering school at the University of Pittsburgh. And you would think, okay, she's the only woman. There's those big buildings at the University of Pittsburgh that they could accommodate her by giving her a restroom. He really didn't want her, but they took her because they couldn't pass her up. She had all the credentials, but they wouldn't dedicate a restroom for her. So she had to go across campus when she needed to in Pittsburgh, where it's in late November and December, and back in January and February, that wind comes off the rivers, and it's a fierce wind that goes right across the campus. And so she has to pick herself up, go halfway across the campus, because they really didn't want her there, but they were there. Women athletes were denied equal participation in sports. Female faculty members were denied equal compensation and promotion. Today, the rise of women in all academic disciplines and in sports at every level is in many ways the direct outgrowth of the landmark Title IX legislation. Women are educated today in the United States because of law, not because of human rights. Congress passed the final version of the bill in June of 1972, and Richard Nixon signed it into law on June 23rd. There have been many times in the last 40 years where the law has been challenged. Title IX has gone back to Congress many more times than most laws, by the last assault on Title IX. That was in 2007. The Education Secretary, Rod Brooks, under George W. Bush, sent out emails asking students whether or not Title IX should be repealed. Donna Deverona and a whole bunch of other women were up on Capitol Hill to let Rod Brooks know what they thought of his email. And he signs the bill. He signs the bill. And with it, he changes the lives of now hundreds of millions of Americans. You're talking 49 years later, hundreds of millions of American women. He changes their lives. They don't have to be, women don't have to just be nurses, teachers, secretaries, telephone operators. They could go to medical school. The quotas are lifted. They could go to law school. The quotas are lifted. Oh yeah, there were, people who fell through the cracks, particularly during World War II, where Columbia University didn't have men students and they wanted to keep going. They had women students take the men's place. So there were examples of where women were able to successfully go to school. But it wasn't just women who were discriminated in school. They were discriminated in other areas, including finances. The funny thing about Nixon, he signs the bill. Doesn't say anything about it. Doesn't say a word about it. When he signs the bill, he talks about desegregation and busing, but he doesn't mention the sudden expansion of educational access for women. And he signs the bill. And that's it. Just signs it. That's it. Gone. Goodbye. Don't need to talk to you anymore about it. At the same time, there was a woman in Queens by the name of Bernice Guerra, G-E-R-A. She was a housewife in the 1960s in Queens, and she was kind of bored. And she wanted to get out of the house. And she starts discussing this with her husband. And her husband's all for whatever she wants to do, fine. Well, what do you want to do? She says, I don't know. Well, let's think about it. What do you really like? I like baseball. Hey, the light goes on. I could be a baseball umpire. And she goes to baseball umpiring school. And she does rather well in baseball umpiring school. And by 1969, Bernice Guerra receives a contract from the National Association of Professional Baseball Leagues to work in the short season Class A New York Penn League, which has disappeared because baseball just got rid of the New York Penn League as they've reorganized minor league baseball, and they got rid of all those short season leagues in upstate New York, all those little cities, Auburn, Geneva, and once upon a time, Little Falls had a team in upstate New York. So they got rid of all that. But 1969, she's going to go there. She's going to umpire. Except they looked at Bernice Guerra. Do we really want Bernice Guerra? And she gets a telegram. She does well in umpiring school, but she gets a telegram from the NAPBL president, Philip Peyton, informing her that her contract was disapproved and invalid with no reason. Well, she didn't exactly take the news all that well, and she found herself a lawyer and sued and spent 3 years pursuing a job in minor league baseball, and would get that job in minor league baseball in 1972 because the court said there's no reason a woman couldn't be a baseball umpire. Well, there are problems with this. There are people. She's up in upstate New York. Geneva and Auburn are playing and staying in a little hotel. And she is greeted by protesters, men who said a woman's place is not behind home, but in the home. So she's picketed. She gets out to the baseball game and she umpires a game between the Geneva Rangers and the Auburn Phillies in the New York Penn League. And in minor league baseball, there are just two umpires. There's a guy behind home plate and there's somebody out in the field behind second base. And that's basically how the umpires run games in the minor leagues, or did back then. And so there is a disputed call. Guerra reversed a double play call. And the Auburn Phillies manager, a guy by the name of Nolan Campbell, comes out and starts screaming and yelling at her. and telling her she's wrong and all. And he also told her, you ought to be in the kitchen peeling potatoes. That was the first game of a doubleheader. She quits in between the games. She said her fellow umpires gave her absolutely, just disdained her. They wanted no part of her. And she accomplished what she wanted to do. She was on the field. People picketing her in front of her hotel room, getting berated by the manager, the other umpires not coming to her defense. She had enough, and she realized that being a woman in an exclusive man's world wasn't for her. But she would stay in baseball. She became an employee of the New York Mets in the community relations department. Billie Jean King, that's Billie Jean King and my father-in-law. We were at the 21 Club and some function back then. And that started my relationship with Billie Jean King way back when in the 1980s. And Billie Jean King and I talked about the evolution of Title IX. I have articles. If you go up on the web and look me up and Billie Jean King, you'll find the articles and the interviews I did with Billie Jean King. They're up online from years ago. Should still be up online. Billie Jean King was a pioneer who captured people's attention long before the Battle of the Sexes in Houston, and made for TV network spectacular, hosted by Howard Cosell, who I knew rather well, and I'm still friends with his grandsons. Justin, who runs his principal at a charter school in Stamford, Connecticut, and his brother Colin, who is the public address announcer for the New York Mets. Billie Jean King and I have talked over the years about women's rights. And while Patsy Mink was trying to get into the congressional gym, Billie Jean King decided that she was going to try to upend the old traditions that left women athletes as second-class citizens. In fact, when she was at Wimbledon, she was Mrs. King. She had no first name. She was Mrs. King, and there was Miss Casals and Miss Pete and Miss Goolagong and all of that back in Wimbledon in those days. So she decides to push ahead. After all, she did learn to play tennis, not the country clubs, but on the streets of San Francisco or that area. Same with Jimmy Connors. Jimmy Connors wasn't a guy who learned at the country clubs. He learned on the streets in East St. Louis, Illinois. The fight. 1967, Billie Jean King, who was about 26 years old at that time, maybe 25, took on the United States Lawn Tennis Association and the policy of paying top players under the table to guarantee their entry into tournaments. She denounced the US LTA's practices as corrupt, and it kept the game highly elitist. In 1968, Billie Jean King won 750 pounds for taking the Wimbledon title. Rod Laver, the Australian tennis player, took 2,000 pounds. The total purses for the competition for the men, $14,800 pounds. For the women, 5,680 pounds. At the 1970 Italian Open, men's singles champion of Romania, Ilie Nastase, was paid $3,500, while King got $600. But the real trailblazing pioneer civil rights activist comes out in 1970, because to get even with Billie Jean King, the United States Lawn Tennis Association decided there would be no tournaments for women in 1970. We're going to show them. We're going to punish Billie Jean King. She has no right being a civil rights activist, at least not on our watch. She pushed for equal prize money in the men's and women's games. She won in 1972 the US Open, then in Forest Hills, and she was paid $15,000 less than the men's champion, Ilie Nastase. And she said, I'm not going to be there in 1973 if the prize money was not equal. It was equaled out in New York in 1973. Tennis is a global sport. It's about as well developed as any sport in the world except for soccer, maybe golf. There are 4 major championships in 4 different countries that attract the best male and female players in the world. The Australian Open, which this year was delayed a little bit because of COVID. The French Open, supposed to be played in May. I don't know about that. Wimbledon, which was not played last year. French Open was played in late September, early October last year, and the US Open, which is supposed to open in August of this year. And there are separate tours for men and women globally. Let's talk about the women globally. You might remember this. You've come a long way, baby, to get to where you are today. You've got your own cigarette now, baby. You've come a long way. 1969, Philip Morris puts out a new cigarette designed purely for women, the Virginia Slims. And Billie Jean King and some others are looking to get a tournament going because as punishment, the USLTA says, we don't have a tournament. And they go banging on doors on Madison Avenue. Look, we need some money. We want to play. Give us a chance. Give us money. Give us money. Give us money. No, it's not happening. But Philip Morris, the makers of Virginia Slims, looked at it and said, you know what? Why don't we put some money into it? It's women, right? And our tagline is, you've come a long way, baby, to get to where you are today. We're selling cigarettes. I was giving a talk in Ridgefield, Connecticut in the summer of 2019. Did a 1969 talk, 50th anniversary. I talked about that advertising campaign. And a woman said to me, I wasn't smoking at the time and I never smoked, but the Virginia Slims commercial was the first commercial ever to appeal to me as a woman. I didn't want to do floor wax. I didn't want to do the stuff that you put on tables, the end dust and all that stuff. And I wasn't interested in dishwashing detergent or laundry detergent. I didn't use the product, but finally it was one-on-one, something aimed at a woman. So there was a thing to that. So it was formed in 1970. Virginia Slims put up money, or Philip Morris put up money for a tournament in Houston, and that would become the basis for the tour. The players, called the Original Nine, rebelled against the United States Lawn Tennis Association because of the wide inequity between the prize money between men and women in tennis. And basically, the United States Lawn Tennis Association dared the woman to go ahead with this. You do this, and we're gonna punish you. You're not going to play in the big tournaments, the Australian, the French, Wimbledon, and the US Open. We're going to keep you out because you're going against us. And the women stood their ground and called their bluff. The nine, Billie Jean King, Rosie Casals, Nancy Ritchie, Peaches Barkowitz, Christy Pigeon, Valerie Zeigenfuss, Julie Heldman, Carrie Melville Reed, and Judy Taggart Dalton. All of those players put their tennis careers at risk, and they dared the USLTA to do something. They flinched. WTA went on. They were hoping only for a couple of years of the cigarettes to be the sponsor, because as Billie Jean King told me once, it was blood money, and they knew it was blood money, and they knew that cigarette smoking was harmful to somebody's health. She was confronted in 1983, a gas protest, anti-cigarette protest, and was asked, why are you taking Virginia Slim's money for a healthy endeavor like tennis? And she said, I believe in the free enterprise system. It's up to the woman herself to make the choice whether to smoke or not smoke. The most important thing is, well, we're well informed and make our own decisions. Ellen Merlo was the director of marketing and communications for Philip Morris USA, and she put the spin on it, which, you know, I've dealt with marketing people my entire lives, and I could see right through it in about 3 seconds. Anyway, they sponsored the tour from 71 to 78. And Ellen Merlo said, when we get involved in any promotion, it's obviously to create a greater visibility for our brand name. But we never, ever ask a player to endorse our product. They didn't have to ask a player. They, by choice, are playing in the Virginia Slims tour. They are endorsing Virginia Slims. You didn't have to ask a player to endorse the product. You know, Bradley Chastain, I interviewed her in 2008. She was the woman who pulled off her jersey after the United States women won the 1999 World Cup of Soccer. And we're talking about the Virginia Slims and all the other problems that people have had in terms of women's sports and even women entertainment to some degree. And I said, how do you solve it? And she said, We need a good old girls network. She's probably right. Girls accumulating money, then putting it into whatever enterprise. That wasn't happening. It's happening now. It wasn't happening back in the 1970s. The Atlanta WNBA team was just bought by a former player. Seattle's WNBA team has women owners, ownership. The St. Louis team in Major League Soccer has women who are the major backers of the team. The New York Mets had a woman owner, Joan Whitney Payson. I use Whitney because that's where she got her money from. And she was a big baseball fan. She was a minor investor in the New York Giants. And when the New York Mets, or New York, was given the opportunity to get an expansion team in the National League, she put up the money. But she was old money. New money is coming into various businesses now. Billie Jean King also pointed out something else to me that I didn't know until she told me, that she couldn't get a credit card. She's earning money and she couldn't get a credit card in her own name because until 1974, many banks required single, divorced, or widowed women to bring a man along with them to co-sign for a credit card, whether it was a father, a brother, a husband, or a friend or a boyfriend. They had to co-sign for that credit card, and some discounted the wages of women by as much as 50% when calculating their credit card limits. Now, I have heard over the years, I had a credit card, I got this credit card, I've got this credit card. Yeah, there were instances where women pushed and finally wore down people to get a credit card. But before 1974, for the most part, women could not get a credit card in their name. In 1974, another Civil Rights Act, the Senate passed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which made it illegal to discriminate against someone based on their gender, race, religion, or national origin. By 1975, women had their own bank. It was called the First Women's Bank. In 1975, it was operated by Judy H. Mello, First Women's Bank. She was part of the Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, Bella Abzug group in New York. The bank, a creation of the feminist movement, established April 1975, the first bank in the United States to be operated by women and for women at a time when its founders said that women were given the short shrift by other banks. And it lasted for about 11 years before it was absorbed into another banking group. It started languishing. But by this point, women had their own checking accounts. Women had their own credit cards. Women had their own careers. And there was really no need for a women's first bank. All thanks to the fact that the women were able to get a different education after 1972. But a report in 2012 found that women were still paying more for credit cards. According to a study by the Financial Industry Regulation Authority, women paid a half-point higher interest rate than men as recently as 2022 or 2012. So, did Title IX work? Title IX opened doors for women in sports, and I keep bringing up sports because that's the problem, and other fields, including medicine and the law. Title IX supposedly bars sexual discrimination in any education program or activity that receives federal funding, including athletics. And there is Birch Bayh with the Purdue women's track team, working out with them. Obviously, he's an older man at this point. This is probably in the early 1990s. Getting back to my buddy down in Deverona. Title IX was a civil rights act that applied to education. Civil Rights Act, not a right. Who was involved in the 1972 fight and is continuing up on Capitol Hill to make sure that Title IX doesn't get watered down in any way. Basically, it said in law school and medical school, sports was thrown in. Big mistake. Really, really big mistake. At its inception, opponents of the law argued that girls and women were not interested in elite sports participation, and opening up new opportunities would only undermine men's sports, not only undermine men's sports, but bankrupt school sports budgets nationally, colleges and universities. The first assault on Title IX wasn't about education. It was about sports. and to take down Title IX. John Tower, the Texas Republican senator, he puts forth a bill, November 20th, the Tower Amendment, which would exempt revenue-producing sports from the determinations of Title IX compliance. Basically, let's protect football. We got to make sure that football doesn't lose any money. We got to keep pouring the money into football. Oh, and the girls, well, whatever is left over, you know, maybe we'll give them something. The amendment is rejected. But here's the problem. The amendment is rejected, but perception. You know, you have a perception of something which you perceive, so it becomes real. Perceived perception. It led to widespread misunderstanding because Title IX was a sports equity law. It wasn't. It was an anti-discrimination civil rights law. Jacob Javits, somehow I didn't interview him in 1980. Interviewed virtually everybody else running for Senate in 1980, including Alphonse D'Amato, who's my lifelong buddy because of that. Jacob Javits was the next guy, the Republican liberal senator from New York, who tried to torpedo Title IX. He submits an amendment directing health, education, and welfare to issue regulations, provide for reasonable provisions considering the nature of particular sports, that clarifies that event and uniform expenditures on sports with large crowds or more expensive equipment do not have to be matched in sports without similar needs, like women's softball. So what? They'll go out there with torn jerseys, hand-me-downs, and all that. As long as our football teams look good, that's all that matters. This guy, Walter Byers. Walter Byers ran the National Collegiate Athletic Association from the 1950s into the 1980s. And his job was supposedly to protect every student athlete. In fact, he came up with the term student athlete as a ruse. It's a ruse. There was a guy by the name of Ray Dennison, played at Fort Lewis A&M, college football. And he was killed on the first play of a college football game. Broke his neck. And the family sued for workman's compensation. And Walter Byers comes up with this term, student athlete. Hey, the students aren't employees of the school, so they're not entitled to anything if they should get injured, maimed, or even die on a sports event. And that sticks to this day. He came up with that term in the 1950s. 1976, remember, he's supposed to protect student athletes. That's what his job, but his real job is to protect big-time college sports programs. And on February 17th, 1976, the NCAA challenges the legality of Title IX. Well, why? Why should they care about education? Well, hey, time to save college football. Suit is dismissed. Title IX has changed college sports played in the country. Before 1972, 32,000 women participated in college sports, according to the General Accounting Office. 163,000 a generation later are playing sports by 1999. Men no longer get 95% of the dollars earmarked for sports. It caused a lot of friction in the men's teams coaching fraternity because men coaches think that the women coaches, the women's teams, men and women coaches, think that Title IX has taken away their ability to get the best athletes for their teams because they can't spend scholarship money solely for men's teams. But it's not about sports. It's never been about sports. Oh, sure, men's sports programs have been eliminated at schools for compliance reasons. But oddly enough, Title IX was never meant to level out college sports playing field. It was to give women sports opportunities as part of an education package. The Title IX original intent was to give women a fair chance at being accepted at a school and for women professors to get equal opportunities at advancing through the system, get tenure. Why haven't I gotten tenure? It's none of your business. We don't have to tell you. Well, I'm just curious to know. No, we don't have to tell you. Stay away. Goodbye. You're lucky to still have a job here. Did Title IX work? Yeah, it did. By 1994, a generation had passed through. 34% of medical degrees earned in the United States went to women, compared to 9% in 1972. Nurses, teachers, secretaries were the careers of choice for most women, or being a housewife. Girls didn't play too many sports. Without Title IX, there would be no Jenny Finch, no U.S. World Cup champion soccer team, no WNBA, no Misty May trainer, no Kerry Walsh, no Lindsey Vonn, maybe no Serena Williams. Virtually every female athlete in the United States today benefited from Title IX in one way or another. But that's not all. Women scientists. Now, I'm sure you have hidden figures in the library. And my buddy Dick Hull, who gave me a lot of his stuff now, because he's 86 and I give some talks and he can't give talks anymore, but he wants his word to be out there. Dick is down in Florida now, and he was with NASA between, say, 1960 and 1975, somewhere in those years. And yeah, he knew the hidden figures, women, and he said they weren't hidden. Everybody knew that they were there. But he said that they were kept away when the big brass got there, until John Glenn basically said, if the woman says I'm good to go, I'm good to go. And that was Katherine Johnson, who recently passed away, who also calculated by hand how to get to the moon. So we got women scientists. She was back in the day, prior to 1972, she was an oddity in terms of she got that far ahead. Women scientists, mathematicians, computer analysts. The workplace is now diversified, totally diversified. But I'm going to leave you with this. And Donna Deverona has told me this. So has Nancy Hogshead and a whole bunch of others. Women need to know that education is not a right. It's guaranteed only through a federal law in the United States. And there were some provisions, and there are some things that need to be tightened up. You got to remember, Franco gave women in 1961 in Spain equal pay. In the Soviet bloc countries, women easily became physicians. They weren't paid very much, communism, but they were allowed to become researchers and doctors. In the United States, we didn't do that. And we started doing that in 1972. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to open it up. Oh, before I open it up, that is me in 2005 in Maui, Patsy Mink's hometown. Thank you, Lynn, for your kind words, and we'll be seeing you down the line.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Enjoy. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.